It's great to see everybody here this afternoon, and I want to actually extend personal thanks to the Humanities Festival for partnering with the Institute of Politics, with I am now affiliated, and also to you, Tracey, for coming here. Welcome back to Chicago. Welcome back to the law school. It's great to have you here.
I'm really happy to be here. It's been a long time.
We had been talking about a conversation that could shed light on a storyline that I think all of us are far too familiar with, especially in the last couple of years, and that has to do with violence in Chicago. And some of you might say, you know, what role does a title Policing Chicago or violence undermining all of that really have to play in a festival where the theme is animal? And I think for those of us who think about the ultimate elements that make us human, we also can think about those elements that in some respects are the least human about our actions, and in some respects the most inhuman or the most animalistic. And I think that for that reason the theme here today and the topic resonates very, very deeply with the issue and the broader theme that the Humanities Festival will explore. I want to begin though by having you give us your perspective on this storyline that's familiar. So last month, we hear, according to FBI statistics, that Chicago's the murder capital of the United States. We saw national stories all through last year with the 2012 numbers. CBS was out here doing big pieces and so forth. The idea is that this is a city that, in some respects, is seemingly out of control. The problem is intractable. How do you and your scholars look at what's been happening here in the last 2 years, especially?
Yeah, I think the FBI statistic is a good place to start. When the FBI noted that Chicago was the murder capital in 2012, that was based on a count of 500 homicides. Now, it's important to note that homicides are not even all murders, so even by calling Chicago the murder capital, that in and of itself is sensationalistic. New York is second with 419, and then Detroit. And it's interesting to compare Detroit and Chicago, just to begin. No, I think there are very few people in this room who would think that Detroit is safer than Chicago, and that would be right? So how do you reconcile the fact that Chicago is the murder capital and Detroit is number 3? Well, one thing you can do is you look at rates. So the homicide rate in Detroit in 2012 is something like 48 per 100,000. Chicago was 17 per 100,000. So right there, that puts it in perspective. Chicago isn't as crazy violent as one might think by that designation. And it's also useful to take a long-term trend view. So even with 500 homicides, and every life is precious, I don't mean to discount by shifting to rates from count to say that the loss of 500 lives is not horribly tragic. It is. But when we're talking about the experience that people have in cities, it's fundamentally different to live in a place where the homicide rate is 48 per 100,000 as opposed to 17. And it's fundamentally different to live in Chicago today than 35 years ago, where there were 970 homicides in Chicago. New York City had upwards of 2,000 at that time. So what I see about Chicago, using the research that I've been immersed in, is that it has challenges, to be sure, but it's a city that's steadily improving. And even in the places where it's the most challenging, it's improving.
You say even in the places where it's the most challenging, it's improving. What makes you say that?
Well, so the next thing you do when you're trying to think about violence in cities is to not think about the city as the unit. Right? Because it turns out that violence doesn't occur all over the city. So even when I say the homicide rate is 17 per 100,000, it's not as if those homicides are randomly distributed. They're not. They occur in particular places. They are concentrated in places. And people who live in Chicago know that they're the places that are rough, and they're the places that are relatively safe, the Gold Coast, but even the places that are rough, let's say the west side of Chicago, West Garfield Park, East Garfield Park, or the south side, Inglewood, even those places are not uniformly hard places to be. They're micro places, actually, that exhibit high rates of crime over time. So some of my colleagues, David Weisberg, I'm actually looking at this book right now, Criminology of Place, And my co-author, Andrew Papachristos, have been able to do some new work to show, and this is a stunning statistic. If you look at crime in Seattle and in Boston, and there's one other city here, let's see, Minneapolis. We can see that street segments, and what that means is the face block between two intersections. In those three cities, they've done analyses, 3% of the face blocks have 50% of the crime over about 20 to 30 years of time.
3%?
3%.
Have more, half of the crime during a 30-year period.
Yeah. And what that means then is if you're not in those face blocks, for the most part, you know, you're not going to be a victim of crime.
Well, this sort of geography analysis is helpful in some respects in understanding the scale and context, but you say that it too is also lacking.
Yes.
It's not just about place, it's about the networks in which we live and are connected. What do you mean by that?
So the face block analysis leads to what people talk about when they say hotspot policing, right? Let's deploy our criminal justice resources in the places where the crime is the most prevalent. And so what that meant about 20 years ago was, well, let's focus on West Garfield Park and not the Gold Coast. The more recent analysis has allowed people to really focus on micro places, as we call them.
This corner.
This corner. Of course, the issue there would be, let's take New York City. If you decide that what you're going to do is to deploy your resources to face blocks or maybe even a street and flood that area with cops and then ask the cops to, let's say, stop and frisk every person you think is a person who's likely to commit a crime, that means you're going to be encountering lots of people, usually young African-American men, who aren't doing anything. Now, why is that the case? Well, there's a demographic analysis of crime, too. So far, we've been talking about the fact that crime is geographically concentrated. We also know that violent crime is demographically concentrated. That is, young African-American men, usually undereducated, without high school degrees, are the people who are most likely to be a victim of crime, violent crime. But it also turns out that within that demographic, a very, very small number of young men in that group are actually ever going to be a victim of violent crime. And you can figure out who those people are, too, through this social network analysis. So in my work here in Chicago, with some of my colleagues, two of whom are here, Deborah Higgins and Tom Hurley, we are doing a group violence analysis. We call it GVRS, the Group Violence Reduction Strategy, very fancy name. And we can look at people who were, one way we do it is we look at people who were killed, victims of homicide. We look to see who they were arrested with, and we look to see who they were arrested with. We call that 2 degrees of Kevin Bacon. And you can create networks of people who are involved in violence. And when you do that, you find that the networks of homicide are extremely tight and concentrated, and that within that network, the homicide rates are something like 300 or more per 100,000. If you can take that network out of the high crime places we were talking about, the homicide rate for everybody else just plummets, right? So if you put demography and geography together, it allows you to come up potentially with a very targeted strategy to address violence.
Well, and so what does that mean for the way we think about how to reduce violence in a city like Chicago? This is something you've been working on very, very closely.
Well, one thing it means that, one thing you don't want to do is to do the things that New York is doing, right? Why would you take a blunderbuss strategy like that, go out and try to arrest your way out of...
Like stop and frisk.
Like stop and frisk. It doesn't make sense. What you can do is try strategies where you communicate directly to the people that you think are most likely to be at risk of being a victim of homicide or actually perpetrating homicide, and you talk to them in a particular way. That's one of the things that we've done. And you basically say, it's almost as simple, I'm not kidding, put down the guns, and they do.
Come on, really?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously.
Yeah, pretty much.
So, I mean, this sounds like we've heard about this sort of scared straight conversation. Is that what you're talking about here? Or what kind of conversation takes place?
So it's probably useful to back up a little and to think about why it is that we think people obey the law, right? Because it's the conversation that we're trying to have with them is a conversation about compliance. And, you know, there are a few theories about why people obey the law. One of them is that people obey the law because they fear the consequences of failing to do so. That's one theory.
And that's one of the theories that actually leads to legislatures and others to ramp up sentencing guidelines, all those kinds of things. Mandatory
3 strikes,
minimums,
you're out, all that.
Yeah.
That's one. Another is people obey the law because they think it's the right thing to do. Another is that people obey the law because they think that government has the right to dictate to them proper behavior. So let's do an audience poll, just for a second. Okay, so which do you think is the most compelling argument or theory of compliance? Raise your hand if you think this is right. People obey the law because they fear the consequences of failing to do so. Okay, we have a smattering. Okay. People obey the law because they think it's the right thing to do. Lots of people. People obey the law because they think government has the right to dictate to them proper behavior. Nobody. Crickets. Okay, so I will tell you that the strategy that we leverage is the last one, and I'll tell you why. The strongest factor for getting people to comply is that they obey because they think it's the right thing to do. Morality is very strong. Government doesn't have very much leverage, however, in that arena, and to the extent that government does, it's the kind of leverage that we don't really necessarily want government to be using, you know, like religion or something. What we typically use are penalties and threats, scared straight. Deterrence works. It's just not long-lasting. It costs a lot of money, and it can backfire in ways that are very predictable. And I'll tell you that, the reason why in a second. Legitimacy is the third, that people obey because government has the right to dictate to them proper behavior. And it's about 5 times more powerful than deterrence. And it's motivated by a theory of social psychology called procedural justice, that basically people obey because they're connected to state authorities, legal authorities, connected to law in very important ways. And there are predictable factors that encourage people to comply. That they are participating in government, they feel like they have a voice, that they are treated fairly, and that they are treated with respect and dignity, that they can tell that the person that's giving them a decision, like I'm giving you a ticket, and is making the decision based on readily discernible facts, that's not arbitrary. These are things that government authorities can manipulate, and that's what we do, actually, in our strategy. So when we're talking to people about putting down your guns, we do it in a very particular way. We don't yell at them. You know, we tell them these are the consequences, but we also give them information about a way out. And it's very highly scripted and stylized. It's in very particular places, not in jails, not in courtrooms. And our results have been pretty powerful, actually.
There's so much here to pull out. Let me go back to one other piece, and I want to stay with what happens in these rooms and why the results are powerful as you see them. You said the sense of participating in government. So break that down. What does that actually mean in practice? Because I think many people live their lives law-abiding and don't actually think that they're participating in government at all. Right. So what does that mean for a theorist like
Let me give you an encounter, a very typical encounter with a police officer. That's not what we're talking about, but that makes it easy. So imagine you have been pulled over and you're stopped. Usually the participation, the way you get the participation factor in that kind of encounter is you want to tell your side of the story, right? So I'm a mom, I have 3 children, and one time I ran a stop sign because one of my kids was yelling and screaming about goldfish or something, and I had to pick up a bottle of water, and I'm trying to get the bottle of water to the back of the van. Yes, I drive a van. And I run through the stop sign. And a police officer pulls me over, and I wanted to tell the police officer why I was doing it. Not because I thought it would make a difference to the outcome. It was just really important to me to say, like, I'm not a bad person, and this is what's going on, right? And I wanted him to hear me. That's participation. He was very nice to me. He called me ma'am. And he said, well, ma'am, you really shouldn't have done that. And I said, yes, I know. That's treating me with dignity and respect. That's a second factor. I have to give you this ticket because you ran the stop sign and he explained exactly what was going on. That's fair decision making. I know that his decision is based on readily ascertainable facts that he and I both can see, and not because I said so. What did I do? I'm just giving you a ticket, right? So those kinds, each one of those factors you can see exhibit indicia of procedural justice. Sure. Exhibit indicia of procedural justice, which are the kinds of things that lead to voluntary compliance.
So this idea of legitimacy, what does it mean in a policing context in a city like Chicago when it comes to officers out on the streets on a regular basis doing their job? What's the change that needs to happen?
Well, it can mean lots of things. I can give you a couple of examples of what I know Gary McCarthy, who is the superintendent of police here, has done. So,
building off of these direct ideas in your conversation, we'll come back to that in a second. But yes.
So, one of the things it's supposed to mean is that you should be, you should be accessible, that you should have conversations, you should answer questions when people ask you questions, you should welcome people into the community for problem solving, and we have that set up here already with the CAP strategy, but which had become a bit more abundant. I think one of the things that McCarthy wanted to do was to use these ideas to invigorate them. But I was thinking in particular, I think it was last year, there was a huge international meeting here. Last year, was it the G7? One
NATO.
of those, NATO, I don't know, one of those. I'm embarrassing myself while I'm being filmed, sorry. They had a very particular training for the officers who were going to be involved with the demonstrators. And McCarthy got lots of kudos for how that was handled. And basically, the training was built exactly on these ideas. They didn't wear the usual riot gear. They didn't wear these big helmets. Even their clothes were different because they were trying to actually change the way they were perceived in terms of interacting with people in the community.
Well, it's this idea, we've heard Superintendent McCarthy say this elsewhere, that it's not just what happens, it's not just the stop itself, but how you actually do the stop.
How is everything?
How is everything?
Yes.
Why is how everything?
Well, part of what's interesting, of course, is if you think about we're in a law school, so if you think about the legal determinants of a stop, all that matters to make a stop legal is that a police officer have what we consider to be a good reason for a stop. Right? So the Fourth Amendment says that a police officer has to have reasonable suspicion to believe that the person that they're stopping has committed or is about to commit a crime. And as long as that police officer can tell a story, has appropriate facts to make that legal determination, it doesn't matter whether the police officer is rude, it doesn't matter if the police officer curses the person out, it doesn't matter whether the police officer tells the person why they're stopping them. The law, the Constitution doesn't care about any of those things. But the psychology of procedural justice that caused people to conclude that their interaction with a police officer is fair depends on all of those things that the law doesn't really take into account. So that's why the how is everything.
You and I both know, though, for perhaps many people in this audience, some people in this audience, people in the city as a whole, but especially for young black and brown men in the city of Chicago, the experience that you're describing in an interaction with law enforcement is not what they experience in the city of Chicago. Not typically. No. Yeah.
Yeah. So, we're working on that. I've been working with the superintendent for about a year and a half now, developing training based on these ideas. And by my last count, there were well over 8,000, we might even be up to 9,000 officers trained for a full day-long training in these legitimacy principles which is a huge commitment, actually.
And his pledge is to retrain everybody.
Yes.
On this, right? Which is what, about 13,000 people on
I think
the force?
it's 12.
12,000 on the force? Okay.
Yeah. It's a huge commitment to take people off the street for a day and have them do this, even in a world in which the homicide rate was spiking. He still was committed to keeping people in the classroom. And it's been very well received. It's one of the trainings that the lieutenant who's in charge of programming says receives either, I think you can have excellent to very good, and then good and so on. It gets a huge percentage of very good to excellent. They actually really
by the
enjoy
officers
it,
who participate.
by the officers who participate. And, you know, some of it's because it's, you know, it's not rocket science, but, it validates things that they know are right, and they also see the ways in which it makes their job easier.
Yeah. What takes place in this training? What are these officers actually going through to help try and reinforce this approach on the how of it?
So what's interesting about that, Steve, is, I'm a theory person. And I myself have given many talks to police executives and even some officers on this stuff. So when the police executives like Gary McCarthy, see me give these talks, they say, oh, you should come back to my agency, talk to our officers. And so I've done some of them, but when I go back, I talk about theory, right? I explain the ways in which the legal determinants are not the same as procedural justice. I use this thing called the compass. And if you array the compass from east to west, whereas east is the most lawful and west is the least lawful, I say, well, you want to be in the east. And then I say, the procedural justice scale will run from north to south. And to be in the northeast is the best, right? It's a little bit orthogonal because, as I just explained, procedural justice is not the same as law. Being in the northeast is the best. I live in Connecticut now, sorry. Being in the Southwest, I've developed this during the whole Arizona immigration thing, is the worst. And, it proceeds from there. And they get that. But it turns out that when you're actually training officers, you need somebody who knows something about the pedagogy of doing this training. And that's not me. So there's a guy, Bruce Lippman, and he worked with my colleague Tom Tyler and I to develop this training. So they do really interesting exercises. Here's one, and I encourage you to look this up. WGN-TV actually did a 7-minute segment on legitimacy of policing in Chicago, and they actually have a 3-minute segment on some of the training. And one of the training exercises goes like this. The trainer asks the officers in the room to come up with the names that people in the community call them. And so they start listing things, popo, heat, pig, whatever. They list it, they're kind of getting into it. And then the trainer says, okay, what names do you call them? And they start, there's silence. And then there was, animals and, other, they didn't use unmotivated. I don't know why that's the word that came, because I'm an academic. Lazy, whatever. But the point was to show how the labeling that they both do of each other sort of takes on a life of itself, and then you have to engage in certain strategies to overcome that, right, in order to treat people with dignity and respect.
This may be somewhat outside your own scholarship on this, but I'm actually curious, because what you describe in some respects would be identified, I think, at the broadest level, is just good policing, right? That's good police work. So how do we get from the traditions that you're, in some respects, trying to reinfuse with the department like Chicago Police Department to what we've seen more recently, where it seems much more antagonistic,
I think that's right. So I wrote an article following a lecture that I did at William and Mary called The Good Cop. And I think so in that article I described two things, that, traditionally when we have talked about cops being good, we think about it as cops being legal. So I've already explained the constitutional determinants, which we know, often in large part, don't line up with procedural justice principles. More recently, however, when cops are good, they're effective. They're good at reducing crime. That's what New York City has given us, right? And neither one of those, you know, the cop that hits all of the legal marks, or the cop that's really good at reducing crime, typically the strategies that you engage in to do those things don't get you to these procedural justice aspects. Now, it turns out, however, that when you do engage in strategies that people consider procedurally just, consider fair, they tend to comply with the law. So that means that you will ultimately end up with lower crime rates. So if the good cop is the procedurally just cop, you will tend to be both legal and effective. It's just the strategies that we've engaged in don't get us to that middle ground.
You've mentioned, though, the New York comparison and the stop and frisk comparison on a couple of occasions, and yet we saw last year, for instance, New York had 419 homicides, Chicago had 500. We know New York's population is significantly larger. The rate, therefore, is significantly lower. They've had a much more dramatic slide in murders. Even as Chicago's rate was coming down, it lagged behind the dramatic turnabout in New York. So why isn't New York's approach an effective approach?
Well, one thing is, it's not clear that the huge precipitous decline in New York is because of stop and frisk. I mean, that is what Ray Kelly says. That's what Mayor Bloomberg says. There's no credible evidence, actually, that would say that. Now, it also doesn't not say it. In other words, you know, you can't tell from they can't make the claim that this is what is causing it.
The data are inconclusive
on
the actual causality.
We don't have enough data. It is probably true, though, that policing in general, better policing in New York, has helped. You know, prison, putting people in prison has helped. The big problem in New York, though, is that even if some of those strategies can lead to declines in the short term, we also know that there are really strong legitimacy hits. So my colleagues Jeff Fagan and Tom Tyler have done an analysis in New York with their stop data, and we know that each additional stop of a young African-American man leads to a decline in legitimacy of their perceptions of legitimacy of police and law that Tom and Jeff can actually connect to increased crime. So it's ultimately a self-defeating strategy.
Yeah, yeah. When my understanding, this is from a conversation you and I had some months ago, that when you first met Superintendent Gary McCarthy, this was before he was connected to the Chicago Police Department, you were presenting some of your ideas, and did he stand up and ask you a question and basically say, "This is ridiculous"? What was the nature?
Ridiculous. That's a charitable word.
He thought you were full of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So what happened?
Full of it. He used a different word. So we were in Philadelphia at the, it was a PERF conference. PERF is, what is that? Police Executive Research Forum, all these acronyms. And I was doing a presentation on procedural justice and legitimacy. He was the police director of Newark at the time. And one of my students at Yale, Matt Clapper, said, well, you should go and make sure you say hi to Superintendent McCarthy. I'll make sure that we make the connection. So he stood up and he asked me some question. He was trying to be challenging. I actually don't remember the question anymore. It's a good thing he's not here. But he was trying to be challenging. We went sort of back and forth, and I said, look, you know, if you don't find it compelling, then, you know, why don't you, if you don't find what I said compelling, why don't you read this? Why don't you read this article and see if you can tell me why I'm wrong? And long story short, about 3 weeks after I met him, I sent him 2 academic articles. I mean, you know, these weren't my speeches. These were articles in the American Journal of Sociology. And a friend of mine who's a journalist in the New York Times called me one day and said, Gary McCarthy just gave a speech to a business organization in Lower Manhattan in front of 200 people, and he was throwing out words like legal cynicism. Where did he get that? And I said, well, I think he read this article in AJS that I gave him. So I called him up, and we've been friends ever since. He's a very, very smart man.
And I want to get back to the intervention piece of this, but because this thread's so interesting. So what kind of conversations do you have after that initial meeting? What's the dialogue back and forth as he starts to think about what he wants to do as a police commander, and you start getting access to more data and refining what it is that you and your colleagues are working on?
Well, I think one way of thinking about the conversations is he's trying to motivate on the ground the theoretical problem I was just laying out in the good cop, right? How can you be an effective police officer and a police officer that people in the community actually welcome into, their neighborhoods, right? So when McCarthy was in New York City, I can't remember his exact title, but basically he ran CompStat in New York City. And so he was the ultimate strategist of effective policing, but not necessarily thinking about all of the ideas that we now spend a lot of time talking about. Where is it that I'm going to put my resources? Let's just make the police executives accountable for the problems and the crime in their geographic areas. And now when we have conversations, he says something like, this is almost a quote, I want people to understand that police officers can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can be effective, but we can also be effective in a way that's legitimate, and it's going to require training. It's going to require reorganizing the department. It's going to require, trying to strip out some of the politics in the department so that there's legitimacy internally, as well as legitimacy as between people in the agency and folks on the street. So those are the kinds of things that we talk about.
So last year we see the murders rising from 2011. He's under a lot of pressure, in some respects, to go back to some strategies that his predecessor had implemented that had to do with special tactical units.
Yeah, the jump out boys.
Yeah. And there was pressure from aldermen and city council saying, look, this all sounds great, Superintendent McCarthy, but, we've got kids dying on corners tonight, and we can't talk a good game. We've got to make something happen.
Right.
And we saw success before.
Or at least they thought they did.
Okay, that was going to be my question.
Yeah.
So what were they seeing?
Well, I think often when people are thinking about violent spikes, right? Well, let me back up. One way people understand what's going on in the chaotic city is to say, the homicide rate is going up. Well, what does that mean? It almost always means compared to this time last year. Almost always. That's typically a baseline. So if we have a spike in July of 2012, that spike, the reference point for that spike is July of the previous year. And what McCarthy wanted to do, and so then if that's the way you think about the problem, then often your strategy is going to be one that looks like putting out fires. If it's high now, then I'm just going to dump a lot of resources on this problem right now and see if it goes down. And so you're just constantly sort of adjusting to spikes that are going up and down. And McCarthy had a long-term strategy. And one of the things I think you saw play out was after that big spike, he kept telling the story, yes, okay, I had a bad January. But once some of our strategies, our violence reduction strategy, other things that he was putting in place actually were able to play out, now what you see is a homicide rate in Chicago that's as low as it's been in decades, actually.
how do we know? I mean, it's too early, I would imagine. We're down, what, to use the year over year, we're 18%, but that was over a year that was higher.
Right.
I think as of last month, or last week maybe, 350 homicides, sort of where we are, which does compare favorably to where we've been, and even in recent years, beyond last year's aberration. But how do we know that what we're seeing this year is actually at all a result of any of the practices you're talking about? It seems to be, it's really hard to try and determine what's actually linked here in any given year,
I think that's right. So I'm putting my scientist hat on. You know, those are things he says. I never say anything until 3 years from now.
Yeah.
And then
I mean, as a journalist,
then I'll tell you.
But as a journalist, I feel like one of the things that has been frustrating about the conversation in Chicago in particular around violence and around the murder rate specifically is that when the numbers are down, it's because the police and the mayor are doing a great job, and when they're up, it's because
weather.
What would you say?
The weather.
Yeah, but the larger point actually is all of this is framed within the context of policing.
Yeah.
And we play this yo-yo, it's a one-loss game, it's box scores.
Right.
And what we're really talking about is a city that has, on any given night, far too many shootings, far too many young people dying, and an inability, it seems, to actually really break through and see what would really be possible. How can we transform the nature of the lives of individuals in the third largest city in America?
So here's one thing you can do, being serious, where you don't wait for 3 years. When I say you wait for 3 years, it's anytime you're doing any kind of aggregate crime analysis. You know, as a scientist, I don't want to do an aggregate crime analysis, you know, where I'm looking at the change in homicide trends over time, unless I have a 5-year chunk of time. However, many of the strategies, or some of the strategies that we're implementing are very focused. So let's go back to the social network analysis. If one of the things we know, and this is true in almost every city in the country, that in addition to, you know, crime being concentrated in particular face blocks, we know that violent crime is concentrated among young, usually men of color, who are connected in particular ways. It's group-based. They're not fighting over drug turf, really. They are in groups, and somebody, you know, insults somebody else's girlfriend, and one young man from group A, you know, shoots young man from group B because of the insult. And then once that happens, then group B feels compelled to return the gift. And I mean it literally, as a gift, in the following sense. I used to have a colleague, William Miller. He studies Icelandic blood sagas. And he wrote a book called Humiliation. And he called a gift an assault. And he called it an assault because when you receive a gift, you often feel compelled to return the gift. And so it's an assault, right? Because you don't want anybody to give you a gift, because if they give you one, then you have to give them a gift, right? And so that's the way homicide works in these groups, right? Homicide is traded among groups. If I'm in a group where one of my buddies is killed, then we have to go out and give that gift back to the other group. And my colleague, Andrew Papachristos, has charted this over time. If you can talk to the people in those groups and say, look, the next one of you that kills somebody, we're going to go after everybody in your group. That's what we say to them. We're going to use every bit of legal leverage we have to make sure that there are consequences for every one of you in the group, so don't kill anybody. Don't shoot anybody. And make sure that your buddies don't shoot anybody either. Try to figure out some other way of solving this problem. You know, we have a police commander who says you can use a shoe. You know, go play basketball, do something else, don't shoot anybody. And we find when we do that, that the violence is quieted. They stop because they don't want to get in trouble, and they don't want everybody else to get in trouble.
I want to get questions here from the audience, but before I do, let me stay with that really quickly, because it brings us back full circle to this interventions piece of it. What you described there, though, sounds to my untrained ear more like strategy 1 than strategy 2 or 3.
Right. It could be that way, but it's not, and here's why. Okay? So if it were simply deterrence, then the communication to these people would be, look, do this, and if you don't, we're coming after you, and that's the end. But that's not what happens, right? What happens is we put them in a particular room, and the communication of consequences is very straightforward. No one's yelling at anybody. No one's preaching. I'm very clear about that. Right, Deborah? We just say, look, it's just my job. It's nothing personal. You have to stop shooting people. You're valuable. You're a valuable member of this community. The community needs you to stop killing people. We need you to stop killing people. You need you to stop killing people. That's point one. Second message is we have somebody who changed his life around, usually his, and he says, I was in your shoes. I made the choice to put down the gun. You can do it too, and here's how, basically. And then the third part of the message is we have people who are usually representatives of social services to say, this is how you get out. So everything is about agency and choice, not threat. It's all up to you. It's your choice. Here's the way you can make the choice. You have value. Nobody's going to make you do this. You're the only one who can do this. Make the choice. And they do.
Let's take questions from the audience. We have a microphone on this side and one in back there. Hands up for those who are interested in asking a question, and we'll come down here to a hand there, and then on this side we'll go here next, if you don't mind. Great. Yes, sir. And I ask that if you, just because we want to get to as many questions as possible, please make it a question, not a comment, and make it as brief as possible. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Ramon Ocasio. And I just read an article in the Chicago Reader about the bond court at 26 in California. And the state players include the Chief Judge, Tim Evans, Cook County Board President, Tony Predwinkle, the state's attorney who's responsible for prosecuting cases, and of course the Public Defender's Office. And the big critique was that the bond court hearings are so short that how could a criminal court judge make a reasonable bond in these cases? And one thing that you highlighted was the whole idea of if we knew what blocks some of the defendants were on, I mean, if any of these state players came to you, what kind of advice could you give them about bond court?
Bond court. Okay. By bond court, I assume you mean people who
are arrested, charged with a crime.
And whether or not they're going to get out of bond or not?
Yeah. How much the bond should be.
What? Yeah.
Electronic monitoring.
Yeah, I mean, I guess... Yeah, state systems are so different from federal systems. So in the federal system, if you're charged with a violent crime, you just don't get out. And there's no bond. There's pretrial detention for people who are violent offenders. I think that trying to get people who aren't truly violent out and participating would be consistent with these procedural justice principles. Since I don't know what people typically are arrested for in the bond situation that you're talking about, it's really hard for me to have a general response, but I can say that to the extent that they're not violent, the presumption should be that they should get out.
Let me follow up really quickly with something you've said before. That you've actually said that policing agencies, law enforcement agencies, perhaps next to corrections systems, are the most innovative places in the criminal justice system.
Yes, it's true.
And the implication there is that state's attorney's office, that the court system are not. What's happening there?
I think a couple of
this points up some of the inefficiencies.
I think that there are a couple of things that are happening. I actually Philadelphia again. I just came from Philadelphia. There was a huge national community prosecution conference, and I did this presentation, and most people in the room had never heard of these ideas. Judges are more likely to know about them. Prosecutors not, and I think it's because when you ask prosecutors the question that I asked you, what's the theory of compliance that you find most compelling? Prosecutors think that people obey the law because that people fear the consequences of failing to do so. And until we change that mindset, it's going to be really hard to make progress in other areas of the criminal justice system. Police don't believe that, actually. When you ask police, they don't ever say
because
that.
They're confronted with the reality.
Yeah, I think so. Or they'll tell stories like this one. I heard somebody say this once. When you were growing up, how many of you were afraid of other cops? Nobody raised their hand. And then the next question was, how many of you were afraid of your mother? And everybody raised their hand, right? So, cops know who counts.
All right, let's get more questions here. Yes, ma'am.
In our mayor and Superintendent McCarthy have recently come out very strongly for mandatory sentencing for gun crimes, and they're using New York as an example as to how it's been effective in New York. And I want to, and yet, obviously, you hear from Commissioner, Head of Cook County, Preckwinkle, that it's not a solution, and there's a lot of back and forth, and I want to know your take on that.
Right. So one of the things that's interesting, if you look at the data in New York, you know, the homicide data, that the huge drop in homicide in New York actually is right around the time that some of the pretty stringent gun laws went into place in New York. So, you know, there's a theory there that would suggest that matters. Now, here's what I think about how that idea can actually be congenial to what I'm talking about. One of the things we know in Chicago is that there are gun laws, but that the state court judges haven't been very aggressive about having people be penalized for having guns that they shouldn't have. And so I think that's probably fueling Superintendent McCarthy's attitudes about this. There are many, many more guns here than in New York City. I think in New York City, they recover something like 5,000 guns. We regularly, and you know, this is in a city of what, 8 million? We get about anywhere from 10 to 12,000 guns off the street in Chicago every year. So I would say that putting that idea together with what we were saying, as long as you give people notice and give them a chance and say, look, these are the consequences that you will face if you don't make the right choice, then I'd say that that's congenial to what I've been talking about. The idea that you can, you know, just sort of arrest your way out by penalizing people with the mandatory gun sentences, I don't think is the wisest strategy.
Let's see other hands here up as well. Okay, great. We'll come down here in front, but here first, next in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for your comments. I moved from Boston to Chicago, and the level of violence is extraordinarily different. The strategy that you're describing for dealing with offenders sounds very similar to the Boston Gun Project.
Yep.
And what they did. Can you talk a little bit about that
Yeah,
and the relationship?
it's based on that. So you must have lived in Boston in the 90s?
I did.
Yeah. So this is a strategy that was developed by my colleague and friend David Kennedy to address youth homicide in Boston. Their group-based violence had a different structure, still does, than Chicago's. The people involved are younger, a little less organized than the groups in Chicago. And the strategy that I was talking about with Steve is based on it in terms of, you know, the thing I developed, but the strategy that I developed was individual. It wasn't really group-based. So this was the Project Safe Neighborhoods strategy that some of you may be familiar with. The more recent strategy, the one I've been working on with Tom and Deborah, is a group-based strategy, almost exactly the same. But what we've done is to infuse it with these ideas of procedural justice and legitimacy. So David called his strategy focused deterrence, and I don't really like deterrence. And so I wanted to tweak aspects of the approach to be sure that it emphasized procedural justice, but the structure of the approach is the same.
Come down here for our next question. Yes, sir.
You seem to have assiduously avoided the use of the term gang. May I ask why?
Yes, because they're not all gangs. Because a group is a more accurate term, actually. So some people are in what many people are, think about as gangs, the vice lords, the Keystone Nation, and so on and so forth. A lot of people, kids really, are involved in group-based activities where they're really not in gangs. And one way you can see that, actually, is that the notion of gangs has a very particular structure. That is, they're longstanding rivals and they're protecting turf and so on and so forth. And the kind of dynamic that I'm talking about is really not that. It's really more groups of people who hang out. Sometimes they sell drugs together, sometimes not. A lot of times they fight with each other. One of the things that we've noticed here in Chicago is that there is more intra-gang homicide than inter-gang homicide. So we just prefer to be as accurate as possible and call it group-based violence rather than gang-based violence.
Let's take another question on this side. I think as you get the microphone. Yes, ma'am. And then we'll pass down to the middle. Yes, sir.
I thank you both very much for your comments today. I wanted to thank you for crystallizing the idea of the ways in which some policing measures can delegitimize the government in the eyes of like black and brown youth, let's say. I saw this firsthand in my experience teaching in New York City. I talked to my students about that, predominantly black and brown students. So my question is geared around the idea of what it means to engage in dialogue that you've referenced. Don Cook, when he opened his remarks, talked about social emotional learning and the importance of that. And you've mentioned the ways in which gangs can group each other, like this group offended my group, so I have to act on that, and the ways in which youth, urban youth, to use that euphemism, and the police each call each other names. I want to think in an idealistic way that engaging in dialogue and practicing empathy is a simple, low-cost solution to this stuff. And I'm curious what you would say about that, but I also, the cynic in me would say that there's no money in empathy. There's money in incarceration. And so, like, the idea of engaging in dialogue seems to make sense, but it's also no money in that. So,
Tracey, what's your sense? Thank you.
So I guess one way of answering the question is to think about multiple sites of dialogue. So the forums that I was just talking about is, in a sense, an opportunity for a dialogue. No, the people who are brought together around the table to have this conversation, there isn't really a back and forth. They are mostly being spoken to for the beginning. There's an opportunity at the end for them to speak to all of the other, the law enforcement people, the service providers and everything. There's a dialogue at the end. But it's a dialogue in the larger sense that it changes the nature, I think, of potential conversations that happen in the future among all of the relevant partners. And importantly, the people who are called into the room are connected to other folks in their families in important ways. And that changes the nature of the dialogue, so to speak. The forum itself is a performance. It really is a performance. And I mean that in the best sense, right? Not to make it seem less than what it is, but actually to give it more weight, to freight it in important ways. But I think another way to think about this idea of dialogue is it allows you to think about multiple sites at which this could take place. So for example, I've just written an article with my partner called How the Criminal Justice System Educates Citizens. And once you think about the fact that the criminal justice system is this site for education, not schooling, but education, that this potential for dialogue happens in all kinds of places that we should be very conscious of, right? And once you're conscious of the message that you're sending out, I'm not talking about what people learn, I'm talking about what we teach and what we do, and then what it means is that state actors need to be conscious of what they are saying, which is one part of a dialogue.
I want to knit these two most recent questions together, if I can, and come back to, in many cases, the youth that are part of the receiving the performance, that is to say. Part of the rationale for retaliating or re-giving the gift, as you would say, I would imagine comes from a number of things. But at one level, does it not come from the need to feel safe? That is to say,
yes,
right? So it's not just anger, it's not just retaliation, it's not just the game is on, but it's if I don't, they're coming back again. And what does it say about who I am, my agency, my power, and the fact that I need to be dealt with on serious terms?
Absolutely.
So how do you get away from that?
So one of the things that that's really important. So I'm thinking of, I've mentioned all sorts of co-authors. One of my co-authors is a professor at the school, Bernard Harcourt, and also a good friend. Hi, Bernard. And Bernard has written a book called The Language of the Gun. And one of the things he's done is map out the reasons why people carry guns. It's almost all young people, almost always for protection. Other reasons, but that's a really strong one, yeah, when you know that this is happening. So this goes back to the question about the gang. What it means is when you're communicating to people about the importance of putting down the guns, you have to do it to everybody simultaneously, right? Because if you do it individually, if you only call in a couple of the gangs and say, look, you put down the gun, the next one of you that shoots, anybody else from another group, we're going to come, we're going to visit some pretty serious consequences on everybody in your group. If you don't do it to all of the groups at once, then the other person says, well, I'm not going to be the chump.
I'm not
who
unilaterally
does this,
disarming here.
Right? Yeah. You have to do it all at once. And there's actually a theory about this, which is another reason why it's not just deterrence. Think about this. If it was just deterrence, you would only need to give people first order information. What's the first order information? That is, what is the consequence of doing the thing you don't want them to do? But there's a second order of information, which we call common knowledge. That is, as policymakers, you not only want people to know the consequences, but you also want them to know that everybody else knows too, right? And we do both of those things, right?
We have time, I think, for one more question here. Let's see where the microphone...
There's a question over here.
Oh, great. Thank you. My apologies to all of you
we can't
waiting
see
patiently. Yes, sir.
There's an organization in Baltimore called the Center for Conferencing, I think, which has evolved a method of dealing with conflict and violence that entails bringing the perpetrators, the victims, relatives of both sides, local community people and policemen together just to talk. Are you familiar with this? And if so, what do you think of it?
Could you give me the name of it again?
I think it's called the Center for Conferencing.
For conferencing?
Conferencing. And it overlaps a lot with some of the things you've been talking about.
Yeah, I've not heard of the center. What it sounds like is sort of a restorative, what they call a restorative justice conference, which builds on the work of John Braithwaite in Australia, and his work is in turn based on a conference of an Aboriginal practice where you actually bring the victim and the offender together and the whole family and they have this conversation. Yes, it is true, restorative justice conferences have many aspects and indicia of procedural justice, which is one of the things I think that makes them valuable. I should say that there's nothing about what the particular instantiation of the theories that I've been working on that are required. I do think, so in other words, there are other things you can do other than the strategies that we've been involved in here in Chicago, but I do think that the theoretical principles should guide almost every strategy that you can do. There are lots of different options within those theoretical guidelines.
As we run up here against the clock, let me just end with this brief question. What do you think is possible to achieve when it comes to the overall number of murders in a city like Chicago? And what role do all of us in the community have to play in getting there?
So I assume you're not asking me for a number. Okay.
No. And we'd love one if you think that's possible.
Here's what I think. In terms of the strategy that we've been implementing, one of the things that I think we can achieve is we can achieve fewer homicides, and we can achieve many fewer homicides. When we started doing this work in 2002 in West Garfield Park, after 5 years, we saw a 37% drop in homicide, in the average homicide and monthly homicide rate in West Garfield Park. It was huge. But what we weren't necessarily doing was turning people's lives around. We were saving lives. People were alive. They weren't dead. But they weren't getting jobs, or they weren't necessarily literate. And there are all these other things that I think we can aspire to, that we can all work on to help, right? And so what law enforcement can do is make sure that people are still here. What we can do is work together to make sure that the people who are here have lives that are worth living.
Tracey Meares is the Walton Hale Hamilton Professor at Yale Law School. Tracey,
Thank you.
Thank you.